Really appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you're here. We want to let you know that we will be recording this webinar. So thank you for joining. And Mike, can you confirm that the recording is starting?
Confirmed.
Thank you so much. So this is our second informational webinar on the Equity Accountability System with the Illinois Shines program. And today we're going to be offering some additional information, which we hope will serve as a helpful resource and overview for you all. We will continue to offer support in the coming months on this issue. Please note that this session is being recorded. And you'll be able to access it in the program resources section of the Illinois ABP website if you'd like to revisit it at any time or share it with your team. Also, just a few housekeeping items. Everyone is going to be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, there is a Q&A section that you can use, and we'll address those at the end of the webinar. So use the Q&A section versus the chat box. And then if at any point you become disconnected or have any technical issues, just go ahead and try to drop off and rejoin the Zoom call. All right, so first I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Casey Doyle. I'm a fellow with the DER, or Distributed Energy Resources Department. I also manage the strategy team for the Illinois Shines program. I'm also excited to be introducing Sharon Johnson, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager, and Sarah Duffy, Deputy Legal Counsel. We are thankful to have all of you here, and if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk about the goals for today. So today's webinar, we want to recap important information covered in the Equity Accountability System, and including the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion goals from CEJA and the long-term plan, the Equity Accountability System itself, including minimum equity standards, talk a little bit about the equity eligible contractor definition and block and EE certification, and provide an in-depth look at what makes an effective or ineffective compliance plan. We'll also review some scenarios where it would be appropriate to submit a waiver application. And then finally provide information for available support and resources in a forum to answer questions. Next slide. So today's agenda is, again, to cover the webinar goals and then provide a recap of the webinar that we held on October 4th. Also some FAQs that came out of that webinar. And then we'll go into examples of compliance plans. We will present the waiver and application, and then also provide resources and a chance to answer any questions that come in today. Next slide. So in terms of a recap of our first webinar, we talked about CEJA and how CEJA amended the IPA Act to expand on the diversity and equity framework through creation of the EAS, including minimum equity standards and the equity eligible contractor category. We go to the next slide. We also talked about who are equity eligible persons and equity eligible contractors. And you can see the definitions here. These are also in the guidebook. And we also talked about what opportunities approved vendors and approved vendor designees have in terms of engaging with equity eligible persons and contractors. Next slide. So the plan lays out the definition and some examples of the EEP and EEC, as well as opportunities for AVs and AVDs to engage EECs, as I said. The plan also provided clarifications on the definition of an EEC. I'm sorry, the IPA provided clarifications on the definition of an EEC, as you can see here. This list can be found on the website under the updates section And just some examples here are who qualifies as someone formerly enrolled in or graduated from a foster care system, how the IPA will evaluate applications on status as formerly incarcerated, which elements of the equity accountability system apply to nested designees, and when the EAS takes effect. Again, you can find these on the Illinois Shines APB website. Next slide. So again, we held an initial webinar on October 4th, introducing the Equity Accountability System. Resources from that first webinar are also on the website, and those include the webinar recording, the presentation slides, an attestation form, and the Q&A document. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Sharon to go over MES compliance plans. Sharon?
Thank you. Good morning, Casey, everyone. As Casey mentioned earlier, my name is Sharon Johnson. I am the DEI manager for the IPA. I apologize, I am not on screen, having a little intermittent issues, so I will be off screen, but happy today to talk about the Equity Accountability System. Next slide. So the compliance plan overview involving the Equity Accountability System. This system has a delivery year that begins June 1st, 2023, and that's when the AVs and their respective designees will need to present compliance plans, and the purpose of your plan should display how you as an AV, as well as your designees, intend to achieve compliance for the minimum equity standard percentage of 10% on workforce projects in the upcoming delivery year. At the end of each year, AVs and designees need to submit a year-end report. And one item to note is AVs who possess common affiliation can submit a combined plan with agency permission when they share a common parent company. And the portal will be available for filing your compliance plan documentation. Next slide. So what's listed on this slide is all of what non-EECs, AVs, and designees must do. You are required to comply with the minimum equity standards, and by doing so, you'll need to file an annual compliance plan, and your initial plan needs to be filed no later than the beginning of the delivery date. I mentioned earlier that it would be June 23rd, so I want to get that date in everyone's head. You need to have approximately, or you will have approximately 14 days to revise or correct or amend your plan after the agency receives it for review. And AVs can seek a waiver only if it's determined you're unable to fulfill any of the MES standards for the delivery year, the given delivery year. So more on the waiver process later. Next slide. So what are the requirements for the MES compliance plan? We should be able to review a brief 2 to 3 sentence statement of intent to comply, dated with the appropriate delivery year, and say how you plan to hire diverse project workforce that will incorporate EECs and EEPs. And the plan should also show the projected number of workers for your project, including items like demographic, assessment by race, gender. Should also include information on any of the training workforce development programs. This can include other avenues for compliance regarding EEPs, former incarceration, participant in the foster care system, etc. This applies and indicates in your plan if you also plan to use EEP contractors as well. So if that applies to your situation, we'd like to see the applicant classification what type of entity it is. That means, is it woman-owned, minority-owned, such details as that. A detailed communication plan of action for local outreach, and we're going to review that a little later when I go over some samples of what an acceptable plan is and what an unacceptable plan is. So there should be local outreach to EEPs and EECs, and this would include such things as how many organizations you've reached out to, the date you've reached out to them, who you spoke with, the result, things of that nature. So also, you need to provide a status on any corrective actions or adjustments for prior years to your plan. So this won't apply for the first year, but that's something to keep in mind as this will be yearly activity. Lastly, the AVs who are affiliated with ABP will not need to report on data about their designees. However, you need to provide information on which designees you've worked with for that delivery year. And this requirement is not meant to alleviate approved vendors from responsibility to comply with the EAS system, but rather just to ensure that we're not double counting. Next slide. So there are 3 scales to determine the quality of the plan that you've submitted. A rating of number 1 means that the pertinent details are missing for us to evaluate a compliance effort on your behalf. So these items need to be included, amended, or they're missing without an explanation of anything. A rating of 2 means all the necessary requirements have been met with no additional questions on the agency's behalf of what you need to answer. And a rating of 3 is a plan that is also approved. However, the difference would be additional action is taken by an entity who has committed in maybe their written assessment to implement internal periodic checks for compliance alignment before the mid-year evaluation in December of your progress for continued effectiveness or potential risk to your plan. Also, the plan should include, if you have a rating of 3, areas of adjustment for future best practices. And again, later on, we're going to see examples of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Next slide. So this slide lists below a few examples of what is not acceptable with a rating of 1. A narrative that's lacking, demographic detail, again, that's lacking, and any other missing reporting requirements. Next slide. And before I review these examples, I want to emphasize strongly that the focus here is the content of the report. So you see this graphic on the screen now, and this is simply going to be a focus on the content of the report and not this illustrative form is what's going to be what the compliance plan is. So the compliance plan form is being developed, and what you see on the screen is not necessarily how the form will look. More information on that to come. But before we see an unacceptable plan, I want you to follow with me from the top to the bottom of what this form looks like. So if you'll notice at the top, we have a delivery year that says all the way at the top, that says 2022. That's incorrect. Also, a statement, if you follow from left to right, left side has the MES requirement. The right side, for the purpose of illustration, has the AV details. So on the left side of the screen, we see statement of intent to comply. And if you'll notice, there's nothing there. So there's no statement of intent to comply. The next requirement, again, following on the left side of the screen, is a project number of workers, which should include race, gender, things of that nature, the workforce training program that they were affiliated with, and any EEP identifiers. If you look to the right of the screen, the only thing we have listed is the number of workers and the gender breakdown of workers. So that would be incorrect. Things of this nature. The last point I want to look at all the way to maybe the midsection of the left side of the screen, communication plan for outreach. There are 2 items listed here. If you look to the right, 2 sentences, very brief, no detail on communication plans, that you spoke with a community-based organization. And if you look at the date, it says May 15th, your plan is due June 1st. This is entirely too close, more than likely, to get any viable results. So this is something that is not acceptable. The wrong delivery year, no statement of intent, incomplete demographic data, and no details for your communication plan for outreach. Next slide. So again, the purpose of this webinar and this slide is intended for you to see display content that must be included for an acceptable plan. And I'll mention that, how this plan should look. Approved vendors should always side on the side of giving more details, more explanation, more supplemental information for an acceptable plan. So this greatly helps us with review of your plan. And for this session, the communication plan does not reflect the depth of what is expected for a communication plan. However, we have some suggestions for what you should be looking for. So again, let's follow from the top of the plan, at the top of the screen, all the way to what's acceptable. So the first line that we see, the delivery year is correct, 2023, that's when it starts. Again, from left to right, the statement of intent to comply has an AV detail with a statement that started and then what you plan to do to comply with the requirements. You have details listed for your project number of workers. It includes the information that we've asked for regarding the race and workforce training detail, things of that nature. If you follow me down again to the communication outreach plan, we have some suggested questions, and these are not what you need to follow again necessarily. This is just a sample, but you should be thinking along these lines when you want to implement your communication plan. What's your plan for your social media outreach to the entities, local organizations that you plan to contact to help you identify EEPs? When did you start that contact? Who did you speak with? Are there job shadowing and mentorship opportunities for position exposure? And again, these list of questions under your communication outreach are just suggestive in nature only. And it will be the entity's responsibility for submitting viable details based on your overarching activities and your intention to comply. Next slide. So what happens if you don't achieve an acceptable status for the compliance plan that you've submitted for approval? The agency will offer corrective plans to entities who are not on track to achieve their compliance, and also in the meantime, you're allowed to continue to have access to the procurement programs while demonstrating good faith efforts to still continue to implement a corrective compliance plan. We've listed timeline details in the middle of the slide there. And lastly, the AVs and the designees must meet all of the MES requirements before being awarded a contract for RECs, unless a waiver has been obtained. Next slide. So confirmation and year-end reporting, midpoint through the delivery year, AVs and designees be notified from the program administrator to verify that your plan is advancing according to the requirements. So kind of like a check-in. And each participant is required to produce a year-end report 45 days after the commencement of the delivery year, where there's been active participation on developing projects. So if there are activities to outline, you have to include that in your latest version of your MES compliance plan submitted at the beginning of a delivery year. So to include details on that plan, you have to have things like comparison data on actual performance compared to the information submitted in your original plan, and any best practices or lessons that you have learned for providing employment opportunities to low-income and disadvantaged residents from environmental justice communities. And the reports will be due 2023-2024 delivery year. So next slide. And this slide is a graphic that represents the visual I mentioned earlier to understand the flow of the process. If you follow with me from left to right of the screen, June 1st is the delivery date that begins in 2023 for the compliance plans. 30 days after the compliance plan rating will be issued around July 1st. Mid-July, approximately 2 weeks after your rating is received, there'll be a deadline for resubmission of your revised plan if you're having issues. December 1st will be the delivery year mid-year tracking review. June 1st, 2024, we'll start a new delivery year, but AVs still need to submit a report showing that they have satisfied all the MES compliance standards. And congruently, submission of the 2024 plan for compliance will also be due and executed. And so we know what to expect past the initial delivery year. There's a proposed increase of the minimum equity standards to 12% for the 2024-2025 delivery year. And the agency will also propose future increases for MES over the subsequent years to eventually reach the 30% point statutory requirement by 2030. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand the presentation over to my colleague, Sarah Duffy, who will discuss MES waivers.
Thanks, Sharon. Got my video on here. Good morning, everyone, or yes, morning still. I'm Sarah Duffy, I'm Deputy Legal Counsel. So we are going to go over kind of the general concept of the waivers and discuss next steps on what we're planning to do in this first year of the implementation while we're still setting up the system. So go ahead to the next slide. So first, before getting into the details of how to apply for a waiver or get a waiver approved, we want to make sure that we emphasize that we expect all AVs to try to comply with these requirements and put in genuine effort to meeting these before considering applying for a waiver. This should be a last resort. That being said, there will be the opportunity to request a waiver, and we have that ability as outlined in the law, and that is going to be project specific. There is some availability for potential for a portfolio approach, but we have not outlined what that would look like. So at the moment, we're going to be reviewing everything on a project by project basis for the waivers. Next slide. So as laid out in the long-term plan, we and directed by the statute are only going to be granting these in rare circumstances. And we are going to only grant them where there's significant evidence that the AV has already done their due diligence towards meeting these requirements. So what that might look like, again, these are generic requirements that we've put in the long-term plan. But as I mentioned later, we'll be refining this over the next few months. But we expect to see a narrative description of efforts that the AV or designee has taken to recruit equity eligible persons, including using the workforce database that we will be launching shortly. But I again want to emphasize that if you that we will not accept sole reliance on the database as evidence of due diligence and sufficient efforts. So we want to see that people have used the database, and if the database hasn't worked, that they've utilized other avenues for reaching out to these populations. So examples might include working directly with the job training and workforce development programs. I know that the CJA ones have not been launched yet, but the Solar Pipeline program and the Multicultural Workforce program are already existing and up and running. Furthermore, there are existing graduates from those programs as well, so potentially working directly with providers of those training programs. Maintaining applications of those that were not selected from previous openings that do qualify as equity eligible persons for future projects. Participating in local job fairs and community events to make sure that you're reaching out to local communities. We'd also like to see efforts to hire directly with the contractors, equity eligible contractors. Those currently registered equity eligible contractors are listed on the Illinois Shines website, so that should be a resource for everyone. Additionally, reaching out to labor unions, that kind of thing. Next slide. Additional elements that we'd like to see in waiver requests, evidence that you have posted jobs and have not received any inquiries or responses to postings from equity eligible contractors or eligible persons. I know you can't really prove a negative, so we're just asking for evidence of those job postings and an attestation that you did not receive any inquiries. Efforts to, again, establish working relationships with equity eligible contractors. So even if you aren't able to use this on them on a particular project, efforts to maintain those relationships for future projects. Use of advertising and social media platforms to try to reach out to these communities and job posting boards. And evidence that you've posted all of these solicitations on relevant state websites, have utilized targeted email services and other resources that are offered by state agencies. Next slide. So apart from the waiver, you know, if you are unable to comply with so if you're unable to comply with the equity standard and you are unable to show sufficient efforts that will result in receiving a waiver, there will likely be disciplinary action, or there may be disciplinary action for failing to meet the minimum equity standard. So that depends on the situation, obviously depends on the timing if it's in the very big. So the determination of whether you have complied with the equity standard will happen at the end of that delivery year based on your end of year report. We have the mid-year check-in to kind of see if the entity is on track to meet that standard. And so hopefully we can get a sense of whether additional support is needed, and so it's not a surprise or a shock when the end of year report comes. But if there has been a failure to meet the standard and there's no evidence or little evidence of genuine efforts or due diligence, disciplinary action may take the form of suspension from the program, either for part of the upcoming delivery year or potentially for the entire delivery year, particularly in instances where there are repeated violations. Next slide. So in terms of how we're going to assess the applications and requests for a waiver for the minimum equity standard, as part of the long-term plan litigation, there was a suggestion or an objection to the plan that the Illinois Commerce Commission adopted in their approval of our plan, requiring that the agency conduct a stakeholder feedback process in order to develop a quantitative approach to scoring those waiver requests, in order to provide more transparency for those who are applying for those waivers, and also to ensure consistent application of those standards and those requirements. So we will be conducting that in early 2023. We'll post all of the details on our website, on the Illinois Shines website. We will be sending out email requests for participation in that stakeholder process. And we have not decided kind of what form that process might take. It might just be written feedback, but we might also decide to do some sort of workshop or feedback session on a virtual platform as well. And the initial draft of those criteria will be based on those elements that I just went through in the previous slides. So that was kind of an introductory look, but we'll have more detailed criteria for a proposed scoring approach when we do that stakeholder feedback process. Next slide, and I think that might be it for me. Yep, so I'm going to pass it back over to Casey, and she's going to go over what's next in this process.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sharon. So let's go to the next slide. So we just wanted to show this slide again because the Energy Solutions team does have a model that represents a level of support for our approved vendors and designees that we want to be able to share. We have sector strategists for each of the sectors listed here, or we'll have them all very soon. These sector strategists provide general and ongoing technical support and can always be accessed by emailing the admin email below, but also the emails that you see here listed on this slide. Next slide, please. Also, just in terms of the compliance plan implementation timeline and the provision of support materials, we just wanted to provide this slide. Again, our webinars are being held in October and November. January is the time frame for when feedback on the waiver request will be and scoring will be held. In February, our team will be providing materials and further training on this process. And then in early Q2 of 2023, AVs can begin submitting their compliance plans. We'll provide further information on the date for that in the upcoming months. And then again, the deadline is June 1st when the EAS takes effect, and the deadline to file those compliance plans. Next slide, please. We also have an attestation form for this webinar. We ask that you fill it out. It's an attendance form, and you can scan the code here or use the link also provided on this slide. And then the next slide. So we wanted to pause to see if there were any questions in the Q&A section. Mike, I don't know if you've been looking at that section.
Yeah, I know the team, including the agency, has been able to answer some questions that have come in, and I'll give the agency the floor if they'd like to revisit or expand on those. I just wanted to share a couple of the key things I heard today among all the great information. Again, erring on the side of more information and compliance plans. was a takeaway, and that the equity accountability system process will repeat each year, beginning this forthcoming program year, but repeating each year. So some useful information. And to your most recent remarks, Casey, I wanted to add that among the support, the program administrator continues to offer office hours, and we'll share those links in our regular announcements through the agency. And we invite people to continue taking advantage of those. They have been fruitful for all involved, and we appreciate that opportunity. I want to ask our esteemed speakers, including you, Casey, but also Sharon and Sarah, if there are any points you'd like to expand to or revisit any of the questions. Audrey, certainly you and other panelists welcome as well too. Anything the team would like to elaborate on? I think there's at least one corrected slide that we can address in a moment too. But I'll yield the floor to anyone.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think the main item that I wanted to make sure that we spoke about was the correction needed on the timeline slide. Yeah, thank you. So yes, this item that's in red, that actually should say, I think July 15th, not June 1st, for the due date of the report that will be provided a year after the compliance plan is provided, that shows that you followed in line with your compliance plan that was submitted the year before. So that we will correct on those final slides.
Thanks, Audrey. Yeah, I think what was meant probably there, and we should have clarified, it's June 1st through July 15th, is that June 1st would be the start of that period for submitting the end of year report.
Great, thank you, and apologies, we'll get that corrected and prepared for the final distribution of these slides in the video. So appreciate the question from a stakeholder and the agency's response to that. We've received another question in the last moment. Is there information about when the database will go live? Is that anything the agency can shed some information on or in further follow-up?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. This is Sharon. I'm happy to speak to that. We're on schedule for the database implementation by the end of January next year. So Q1 of next year. We've had some details that we'd like to include to make it more user-friendly. And so with the holidays coming up, we want to allow enough time to say confidently that we will have that up and operational January of 2023. And there'll be more information posted in further communications on that rollout.
Thanks, Sharon. And oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, can I just speak to the other question that
yes, please.
This participant posted about data to populate the database? That will be kind of a process. So it will be hopefully, increasing amount of data and number of people participating as time goes on. As everyone can imagine, we do not have an immediate roll call of all of the equity eligible people in the state already identified. So it's going to be a process of working with DCEO, working with other community organizations, doing outreach to make sure that these people know this database exists. And if they are looking for opportunities in the solar energy workforce, that they enter their data and kind of create a profile and get themselves in the database. So it is going to be a process. I just want to set expectations that it's not going to show every person that might qualify as an equity eligible person on day one of going live. Unfortunately, that's just kind of the reality of the situation we're in. So please be patient with us as we make sure that as many people that qualify have access to this database as possible. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks also for your earlier slide, including reference to the Solar Pipeline Program and the Multicultural Workforce Program that are already launched and have produced some graduates as already, which is very helpful. And the strategy team I know is doing a great deal of community outreach for equity eligible contractors, and that's certainly elevating awareness of the program and demand for equity eligible persons as well too. So great, and thank you, Sharon, for the initial information on the database and timelines there. Have another question that's come in. If it's okay, I'll pose to the panel and let me know if in position to answer that. It was mentioned that FEJA trainees or grads qualify. Will there be outreach to those programs to be included? So that's something the agency wants to speak to in terms of stakeholder roles there and how to think about that arena.
Yes, I can comment briefly about outreach. We want to try to incorporate as many potentially qualified EEPs as possible. So there's definitely strategy for outreach to specific programs. Again, as Sarah mentioned, we're working closely with DCEO for additional training program information. So that'll be at a later date, but yes, there's definitely outreach for this group.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Sharon and Sarah. Other questions from our audience or other points that our panelists would like to make? We're doing nicely on time and have a few more minutes we can take advantage of if there's information. Administratively, I'll share that the Q&A will be published after the webinar as well too, but go ahead, please.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to note something based on that last question about FEJA trainees. I just want everyone to kind of note in this definition that the definition and the statute, so that means that we cannot at this point change it, only lists the solar training pipeline and the multicultural jobs programs created and funded by FEJA. There are other training programs that FEJA funded. Those would still not be eligible because they are not specifically listed here. So I just want to make sure that's clear and that people aren't recruiting people that they thought were qualified and then suddenly find out that they're not qualified. It's only the solar training pipeline and the multicultural jobs programs that would qualify.
Great, thank you, Sarah. That's an important clarification. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we've got most of our live questions answered, in fact, all of them, and then we have some offline follow-ups. I'd like to invite any final questions at this time, or if anyone from the agency or certainly UKC would like to share any further information or rewind on any points, knowing we have another couple moments. Any further questions or data to be shared?
Hi, Mike, this is Casey. One question that I've seen come in on, through our admin email is what is an equity eligible investment community, and is there a list that can be provided? I don't know if
so that is also defined by statute, and it's either an environmental justice community defined under Illinois Solar for All, and there's a map of that on the Illinois Solar for All website, or an R3 community, which is designated under the Cannabis Act. I'm not sure of the full title of that act, but the Cannabis Legalization Act. And I believe we are very close to having a map that shows both of those in one spot, and that will be kind of included in the resources with the Equity Energy Workforce database.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Great, thank you. Good information and another resource everyone can look forward to. Wonderful. Well, I'll just zip ahead then one more time to our overall timeline on compliance planning, just give everyone a moment to look at that. Audrey, I want to invite you. Do you have any closing or further remarks before we adjourn for today's webinar?
No, nothing for me. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning and working with us as this system gets set up. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. We're going to make that correction on the timeline slide. Again, we appreciate the close eyes from a stakeholder to allow us to correct that. We'll get the recording, the slides, and a full and complete question and answer added to the program website. You can expect to see information on that in our upcoming weekly announcement later this week. And we thank you all for joining. Thank you for making the time. And we look forward to working with you to be successful in this arena. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.